This is the third video of Unit 3.1 in the IB Economics International Economics syllabus. In this video, I'm going to explain and discuss the theory of comparative advantage. So the IB Economics learning outcome is to be able to explain the theory of comparative advantage and describe the sources of comparative advantage, including differences between countries in factor endowments and levels of technology. And this is what I'm going to do now. Comparative advantage is basically a situation when a country can produce the same amount of a good or service at a lower opportunity cost. That means the opportunity cost it incurs in producing the same amount is lower than the other country. Where does comparative advantage come from? What are the sources of comparative advantage? They're very similar to the sources of absolute advantage. Different countries are endowed with different factors of production. Some countries have a really large population and therefore they're endowed with abundant and cheap labor. Some countries are endowed with a lot of natural resources and minerals. So different factor endowments give countries different comparative advantages. Also, the different levels of technology. Some countries are very technology rich and therefore can produce goods and services that require specialized and highly technical technology. Some countries don't really have the same levels of technology. These are the sources of comparative advantage. So let's go back to the example that I introduced in the previous video about absolute advantage. We can see here that France can produce 7,000 bottles of wine and 800 tons of cheese, while Italy can produce 5,000 bottles of wine and 200 tons of cheese. You can see from looking at these two production possibility curves that France has an absolute advantage in the production of both. Does this mean that France and Italy can't specialize and trade? Not necessarily. What explains the fact that France and Italy will probably still specialize and trade is the theory of comparative advantage. So let's see how that works. So as we've seen earlier, France can produce 7,000 bottles of wine or 800 tons of cheese. So let's see what's the opportunity cost of one bottle of wine for France. Essentially, you would take this number, 7,000, you would divide it by 7,000. So one bottle of wine, 1W. Do the same with this 800. So 800 divided by 7,000 gives you 0.114 tons of cheese. So essentially, one bottle of wine requires France to sacrifice 0.114 tons of cheese. Let's do the same with Italy. So we'll take this number, 5,000. We'll divide it by 5,000. So that gives you one bottle of wine. Take this number, 200, also divided by 5,000. It'll give you 0.04 tons of cheese. That means the opportunity cost of one bottle of wine for Italy is only 0.04 tons of cheese. What is better to sacrifice or to give up? Which is a lower trade-off? Which has a lower opportunity cost? 0.04 or 0.114? You can see that the opportunity cost of producing wine for Italy is much lower because it only gives up 0.04 tons of cheese. This means that the production of wine for Italy comes at a lower opportunity cost. So Italy should specialize in the production of wine. Let's do the same for cheese. Let's do the same with the cheese. So let's divide France's cheese, 800 by 800, gives us 1 unit of cheese, requires France to sacrifice 8.75 units of wine. While if you divide the cheese in Italy by 200, 1 unit of cheese requires Italy to sacrifice 25 units of wine. So which country has a lower opportunity cost? It's France. Therefore, France, in this example, has a comparative advantage in the production of cheese. So let's go back to the original diagram. We saw that France has a comparative advantage in the production of cheese, while Italy has a comparative advantage in the production of wine. Without doing those sometimes confusing calculations, even though you need to be able to do them, just by looking at the diagram, you can deduce which country has a comparative advantage in what. You can see the distance x is much larger. This distance here, x, is much larger than the distance y. Therefore, France is much better at producing cheese because the distance between 800 and 200 is much larger, while Italy should therefore specialize in the production of wine. So now we can draw a diagram to show comparative advantage. We can calculate the opportunity costs from a set of data in order to identify comparative advantage, and we can draw a diagram to illustrate comparative advantage from a set of data. The last IB learning outcome in this topic is to be able to discuss the real-world relevance and limitations of this theory. So this theory has many limitations, and some economists criticize it. They say that it's not very relevant to the real world. Why? First, they say the assumptions on which the theory rests are very weak. The assumptions are each country can only produce 2 products, right? Which is not real because countries produce a lot of products. Okay, so the assumptions on which the theory rests are very weak, or they're a limitation of the theory. The second factor you need to consider is the costs and benefits of specialization. Specialization brings about a lot of benefits. Countries can specialize in what they're good at, and therefore everybody gains. There's a bigger amount of output for everyone to enjoy. But there are also costs to specialization. It becomes very dangerous for a country to become over-dependent on importing what it doesn't produce from other countries. Once, say for example, there's a war, an international conflict, it becomes very hard to import these things that the country doesn't specialize in producing. And of course, another factor you need to consider is the arguments in favor and against free trade and protection. This will be covered in a later video when I talk about protectionism and the arguments for and against protectionism. And there you have it, the theory of comparative advantage.